Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. Maren Ashby came into Polreath on the carrier's cart from Truro on the last day of October, arriving in the early afternoon when the light was already beginning to go. The driver let her down at the top of the village where the lane narrowed past the point a cart could sensibly go, a courtesy she had not needed to ask for. The man simply drawing up the horse at the right place with the ease of someone who had been making this particular calculation for years. She thanked him and lifted her bag down and stood while the cart turned and went back the way it had come, the sound of the wheels on the stone lane fading as it descended toward the main road. Then silence, or not quite silence, the wind off the sea, which was its own continuous presence here, and the sound of the village below her, the particular low sounds of a Cornish harbour settlement in the late afternoon. But underneath those sounds, the quality she had been aware of since the cart first rounded the headland and the coast came into view, a quality she had no better word for than weight. The particular weight of a place that had been here a very long time and had no interest in explaining itself. From here she could see the lighthouse. She had been able to see it since the cart had crested the last rise on the Truro road, the white tower visible above the headland to the east, but she had not allowed herself to look at it properly until now. She stood at the top of the village lane and looked. White, or what had been white. The tower weathered now to a grey-white that was closer to the colour of the headland's granite, the render patchy in places where the sea wind had worked at it over many years. The lamp room at the top dark in the afternoon, not lit, not doing anything, simply present at the highest point of the headland, watching the sea below as it had presumably watched it for 140 years. Her father's lighthouse, now hers, as of 6 weeks ago, when he had died quietly in his sleep in the keeper's cottage attached to the tower's base, and the solicitor in Truro had written to inform her of the bequest with the same courteous brevity with which solicitors informed people of everything, the facts first, the feeling left entirely to whoever received them. She picked up her bag and started up the coast path. The coast path climbed steeply from the village. She had done this walk many times as a child had run it in the summers, the particular carelessness of a child who had not yet learned to be cautious on cliff paths. She did not run it now. She walked it carefully, the path narrowing as it climbed, the village falling away below, and the sea opening up on her left, grey and enormous and entirely itself. October sea. She had forgotten what the October sea looked like from this particular cliff. Not the summer sea she had occasionally persuaded herself to remember when she thought about this place, that version, bluer and more manageable and less entirely present. This was the sea her father had looked at for 40 years of October's grey, enormous, the swells long and unhurried, the surface not rough exactly, but deeply serious. The sea fully engaged in its own business, without any reference to what was happening on the land above it. The wind pressed steadily against her as she climbed. the particular Cornwall wind that did not so much blow as insist, the kind that had an opinion about whether you should be standing here and was not shy about expressing it. She had forgotten this too. The way the wind on this headland was not a weather event but a permanent condition, a fact of the place as fixed as the rock beneath the path and the sea below the cliff. She stopped halfway up and looked back at the village. Polreath from above, the handful of stone cottages along the harbour front, the small fishing boats at their moorings in the harbour basin, the single inn she had passed on her way through, the Methodist chapel at the north end of the village, all of it very small against the scale of the headland and the sea beyond. She had grown up here until she was old enough for boarding school in Truro, and the village had seemed to her then an entirely sufficient world. She could see now, had been able to see for decades, from the distance of London and research trips to other countries, how small that world actually was. She was not sure the seeing made any difference to how it felt to be back in it. She turned and kept climbing. She reached the top of the headland, the lighthouse here much closer now, the tower revealing its true height, the lamp room visible above her. And beside it, small in comparison, the keeper's cottage, low and solid, 2 windows facing the sea, a door with a small porch over it, the whole thing built with the particular functional plainness of Victorian utility buildings that had not been intended to be beautiful and had become so anyway, through age and the specific beauty of things that had simply lasted. She stood and looked at both for a long moment. The lighthouse and the cottage and the headland and the sea, the grey October light on all of it, the wind pressing steadily against her, the sound of it around the tower, a continuous low note that had presumably been the background of her father's entire adult life here. She thought about that, about what it meant to have a sound as the constant background of 40 years, the way you stopped hearing it eventually, and it simply became the texture of your own thinking. She went to the cottage door. The key was in her coat pocket, sent by the solicitor. She put it in the lock and turned it, and the door opened inward into the smell of the cottage, the particular smell she had been bracing herself for, and which arrived exactly as she had expected. The accumulated domestic smell of one person's 40 years in one place, still entirely present in the walls and the furniture, even now that the person was gone. Wood smoke and salt air and the smell of the tea he had drunk every morning, and something else underneath all of it. Something she could not name precisely, but recognized completely, the smell of her father, of his specific inhabited presence, which had apparently been absorbed so thoroughly into this building that 6 weeks of his absence had not been enough to diminish it. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside. The cottage was small. She knew this from childhood visits, had understood, even as a child, that her father had chosen to live very small, that the scale of the cottage suited some quality in him that the larger houses of the world did not accommodate. A sitting room immediately inside the door, the proportions of it modest, the furniture arranged with the practical economy of someone who used every surface for something and wasted nothing on appearance alone. She set her bag down and looked around. The shelves on the north wall holding his books, maritime history, navigation, natural history of the sea, novels she did not recognize, the accumulated reading of a man who had spent his evenings in one place for 40 years and had read carefully through a good portion of what interested him. The spines, various ages, various conditions, some clearly read many times, the covers worn to softness. She walked slowly along the shelves and looked at the titles without pulling any out. Not yet. The worn armchair beside the small fireplace, the shape of it entirely his, the indentation of decades of the same person sitting in the same position, the armrests worn smooth in the same places, the cushion compressed to the specific form of one body. She did not sit in it. Some things required more preparation than others. The fireplace itself cold, the grate empty, the hearth swept. She had not expected otherwise. He had been gone 6 weeks, but the wood basket beside it was full. She noticed the logs stacked neatly, ready. Someone had filled it recently, or her father had stacked it before he died, not knowing it was the last time he would perform this small, practical act, the act of someone who intended to keep living here and was preparing accordingly. She stood and looked at the full wood basket for a long moment, the simple evidence of a future that had not arrived. She went to the window. The sea from here, the cottage's 2 front windows, both facing directly at the horizon, the view unobstructed, nothing between the glass and the October sea except the headland's edge and then the long grey drop to the water below. Her father had looked at this view every morning of his working life and every evening and presumably every night too, since the lighthouse and the sea were simply the view from every window of this cottage, the permanent background of every thought he had ever had here. She thought about him standing at this window, about the last time she had seen him not here but in London, the previous Christmas, when he had come up on the train and they had spent 2 careful days together, carefully affectionate, carefully not discussing the ways in which the distance between them had grown, without either of them making a deliberate decision to let it grow. He had seemed well. He had seemed entirely himself, quiet, attentive, the same economy of speech she had always associated with him, the quality of a man who had spent most of his adult life in a place where there was no one to talk to and had arranged his thoughts accordingly. She had not known it was the last time. She supposed one never did, unless one had reason to suspect it, and she had not. His bedroom was at the back of the cottage, small, like everything else. A single bed, made, the coverlet pulled smooth, the pillow straight, the habit of someone who had made their bed every morning for 60 years regardless of whether anyone else would see it. A chest of drawers, a small table beside the bed with a lamp and a book. She looked at the book, a novel, the cover worn, a library bookmark 3/4 of the way through. He had not finished it. She picked it up and looked at the open page, the last page he had read, and set it back down without reading it. Some things were private in a way that had nothing to do with secrets. On the wall, above the chest of drawers, a single photograph. She and her father, on the headland. She was perhaps 8 or 9, the lighthouse behind them, his hand on her shoulder, both of them looking at the camera with the particular expressions of people who were not accustomed to being photographed and were not entirely sure what to do with their faces. She did not remember the photograph being taken. She did not remember who had taken it. She stood and looked at it for a long moment, at the small girl and the tall man and the lighthouse behind them in the summer light. She had been so small. She had forgotten how tall he was. On the chest of drawers beneath the photograph, 3 objects arranged with the care of things that mattered. A compass, old, brass, the kind of instrument that had been made to last and had done so. A smooth stone, grey-blue, the colour of the sea on a particular kind of day, which she recognized immediately as one her mother had kept on the kitchen windowsill throughout her childhood, and which she had not thought about in years. And a small notebook, the cover worn dark with handling, the kind of notebook that had been carried in a pocket for a very long time. She picked up the notebook, held it for a moment without opening it, set it back beside the compass and the stone. She would come back to it. She made tea in the small kitchen. The kitchen stocked, not fully, but adequately, the provisions of someone who had intended to keep living here and had been simply interrupted. Tea in the tin, the same brand he had always kept. Dry goods in the cupboard, the particular frugal sufficiency of a man who had learned long ago to live on very little and had found this arrangement entirely satisfactory. She made the tea and stood at the kitchen window, which faced inland toward the moorland and the distant suggestion of the village rooftops below. She drank slowly and thought about her father, about the particular life he had chosen, not fallen into. She had always understood, but actively chosen. He had applied for the keeper's position at Polreath when she was 4, when her mother had still been alive, and the posting had meant moving them all from Truro to this headland. Her mother had not minded, she had always said. Her mother had loved it here, had loved the sea and the headland and the cottage and the particular life the lighthouse required. Her mother had died when Maren was 11, and her father had stayed, had raised Maren here alone until she was old enough for boarding school in Truro, and then university in London, and then the career that had kept her in the city. He had stayed for 40 years after her mother's death, and had never once suggested that staying was difficult, or that he had considered leaving. She had assumed this was simply where he was, the place that had become so entirely his that the question of leaving had simply never arisen. She thought, "I assumed a great many things about you." She thought, "I am not sure how many of them were right." She finished her tea and set the cup in the small stone sink. Then she went to find the door to the tower. The door connecting the cottage to the lighthouse base was in the kitchen's back wall, low, iron-framed, built to last indefinitely, and having done so, she opened it and stepped through. The tower's interior circular, the stone walls curving away from her in both directions. The smell different from the cottage, immediately damp stone, old metal, the particular smell of a lighthouse interior that had nothing domestic about it, nothing softened by daily life. The smell of the function of the place, stripped of everything else. The stairs began immediately. Iron, spiral, the steps worn slightly hollow in the centers from a century and more of feet ascending and descending. She put her hand on the rail and began to climb. The first level, a small landing, a door to a storeroom. The second, another landing, a window to the east, the October sea visible through old glass. She climbed, the light changing as she went higher, coming in differently at each landing. She was aware of the wind more strongly up here than in the cottage, the tower conducting it, the stone carrying the sound of it upward through every level. Her father had climbed these stairs every evening of his working life. She thought about that, about what it meant to know a staircase so completely that you could climb it without thinking, the way she navigated the stairs of her own London rooms in the dark. She came out through the hatch into the lamp room and stopped. The lamp room was not as she had expected. She had expected something neglected, the official light decommissioned in 1862, the lamp room presumably long disused, the great Fresnel lens perhaps still in place but long dark, the whole apparatus suspended in the particular kind of abandonment that happened to working things when their work was taken from them. The lens was there, The great Fresnel lens, the concentric rings of prisms surrounding the lamp at the center, the whole apparatus still in place as it had been for 140 years, designed to take whatever light was given to it and amplify and direct that light across the darkness of the sea. But it was not neglected. She stood in the lamp room and understood this slowly, going around the lens with her eyes, taking in what she was seeing. The glass of the prisms clean, not dusty, not salt-hazed, but clean, recently cleaned, the particular clear quality of glass that had been attended to. The metal of the mechanism free of rust. The rotation assembly, the system that turned the lens to produce the lighthouse's characteristic sweeping beam oiled, maintained, the gears visible through a service panel that had been recently opened and closed. Someone had been caring for this lens, not in the past, recently, consistently, with the same methodical attention with which it had been cared for throughout its working life. She looked at the lamp at the center of the lens. It was not the original electric lamp from 1962. That would have been disconnected when the light was decommissioned, the power supply cut, the whole electrical system made redundant by the withdrawal of the lighthouse's official function. What was here now was something different, an oil lamp, fitted carefully into the original housing with the precision of someone who understood exactly what they were doing. The reservoir full, the wick trimmed and centered, the whole apparatus ready to be lit. She stood very still, the wind pressing against the glass of the lantern, the sound of it a continuous low presence. The sea below visible in every direction, the grey October sea in the grey October afternoon, and on the southern horizon a darker grey that suggested weather building, moving toward the coast. She thought about what she was looking at. An oil lamp, full, trimmed, ready to be lit, and a lens maintained to the same standard that had been required when this was a working lighthouse with legal obligations to the ships that passed this coast. Her father had been dead for 6 weeks. She walked around the lamp room once, slowly, looking at everything. The service panel she had noticed, a small shelf to one side of the lens housing holding oil for the lamp, 2 full cans, both recently placed. A cloth folded neatly on the shelf beside the oil, the cloth used and cleaned and folded again. The tools of someone who had been doing this for a very long time and had developed their own orderly system for doing it well. She looked at all of it and understood something she had not known before. Her father had not simply stayed at the lighthouse after it was decommissioned. He had continued to operate it quietly, without authority, without any official sanction, without any navigational necessity that she could immediately identify, and without telling her. He had climbed these stairs every evening and lit this lamp and let the beam go out across the October sea and the summer sea and the February sea and every other sea this coast had to offer, for some number of years that she could not yet calculate, but that appeared, from the condition of everything in this lamp room, to have been considerable. She thought, "You never stopped." She thought, "I did not know that." She came back down the stairs slowly. She spent the rest of the afternoon in the cottage, not doing anything specific, simply being in it, the way you needed to be in a place before you could properly understand what it required of you. She looked more carefully at his books. She looked in the kitchen cupboards and noted what was there. She went through the sitting room slowly and looked at each object with the particular attention her research work had trained in her, the habit of looking at old things carefully and reading them as evidence of the lives that had made them. She found the small notebook again. She had left it on the chest of drawers in his bedroom, and now she came back for it and stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at it without picking it up. the cover worn dark with handling, the size of something carried in a coat pocket. She thought about what might be in it and found she was not certain. Not certain enough to look yet. The afternoon still too new. Her presence in this cottage still too recent to feel like she had earned access to his most private things. She left the notebook where it was. She made something simple to eat in the small kitchen as the afternoon gave way to evening, the light outside going from pewter to a deeper grey that was approaching darkness. She lit the kitchen lamp oil, like the one in the lighthouse, the cottage still using the same fuel that had served this headland for a century, and ate at the small kitchen table and listened to the wind. It was picking up. The building weather she had seen on the southern horizon from the lamp room was arriving, not a full storm, not yet, but the advance of one, the wind increasing by increments, the sound of the sea below the headland becoming more emphatic. She went to the sitting room window and looked out at the darkness and saw nothing but the darkness, the headland invisible, the sea visible only as the general quality of a greater darkness beyond the headland's edge. She went to bed earlier than she would have at home. The spare room small, the single bed made up with the same neatness as his own, the room of someone who kept everything in order, whether or not it was being used. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind against the cottage walls and thought about tomorrow and what she would need to do about the lighthouse and the cottage and all the practical questions she had come here to resolve. She did not yet know what resolving them would look like. She had come with the intention of assessing and then deciding an approach that had served her well in her research work, the discipline of looking carefully before concluding. What she had not anticipated was arriving and finding the lamp room full and tended and ready, the lens maintained, everything prepared, as though the lighthouse expected to go on doing what it had always done, regardless of what had happened to the man who had been doing it. She closed her eyes. The wind outside, the sound of the sea below the headland, more insistent than it had been at dusk. She was somewhere between waking and sleeping when she saw it. Not from inside the cottage, a movement of light against the ceiling of the spare room, coming through the small window that faced the tower, a light sweeping steadily across the ceiling above her and continuing and sweeping back. She sat up. She went to the window in the dark and looked out. The lighthouse was lit, the lamp turning the Fresnel lens, doing what a Fresnel lens did, rotating, the beams sweeping out across the October sea in its regular rhythm. 4 seconds between each sweep, the same timing she had grown up with, the same rhythm her father had maintained for 40 years. The light reaching out across the darkness of the sea, reaching toward the horizon, doing what this light had been built to do from this headland for 140 years. She stood at the window and looked at it, the beam sweeping past. 4 seconds, passed again. She had not lit it. She had come down from the lamp room in the afternoon without touching the lamp, had not attempted to light it, had not even considered it, had simply looked at it and noted its readiness and come back downstairs. She had eaten her supper and gone to bed. She had not gone near the tower after coming down. She had not lit the lighthouse, and yet it was lit, the beam sweeping past the window in its steady rhythm, the headland above Polreath doing what it had always done, the light going out across the sea that received it with its usual vast indifference. She stood at the window for a long time, the beam sweeping past. 4 seconds, passed again, passed again. Below the headland, the sea was building the wind, doing what the arriving weather required, the waves longer and heavier than they had been at dusk, the lighthouse light catching the top of each swell as the beam passed over, each wave briefly illuminated and then dark again, the sea in its 4-second rhythm of light and dark. She thought about the oil lamp in the lens housing, the full reservoir, the trimmed wick, the rotation mechanism oiled and maintained, everything ready, as though the lighthouse had expected this, had expected someone to come and do what needed doing. The same someone who had apparently been coming for however long her father had been gone, lighting the lamp each evening without requiring anyone's permission and without offering any explanation. She pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window. The beam swept past. 4 seconds, she thought. Who are you? The lighthouse did not answer. It simply continued, as it had continued for 140 years, sending its light across the darkness of the October sea, reaching toward whatever was out there in the night. She woke before dawn. Not from any sound. The cottage was quiet, the wind from the night before having settled into something lower and steadier than the building gust that had accompanied her to sleep. She woke the way she sometimes woke at home in London, in the particular darkness before the city began its own noise, a wakefulness that had no obvious cause and required nothing except patience. She lay still and thought about the lighthouse. The beam had been there when she had gone back to bed. She had stood at the window for what she estimated was 20 minutes, watching it, before the cold had made standing there impractical, and she had gone back under the covers without any better understanding of what she was seeing than when she had first seen it. She had not gone back to the tower. Some instinct had kept her in the cottage, the particular restraint of someone who had learned, in her research work, that going at a thing too quickly was its own kind of failure, that some discoveries required more preparation than simply walking toward them in the dark. She got up. She dressed in the cold spare room, the cottage unheated overnight, the October chill of the headland having worked its way through the stone walls, and went to the spare room window. The lighthouse was dark, the tower visible against the sky, which was not yet light but was approaching light, the particular quality of the sky before dawn at this time of year, the darkness becoming slightly less absolute in the east without committing to any particular colour. The lamp room dark. No beam, no movement, nothing. She stood at the window for a moment, then went to make tea. She went up the tower at first light. She had waited, had made her tea and drunk it at the kitchen window, watching the sky to the east slowly admit the morning, the headland's outline becoming clearer, the sea below it resolving from darkness into its October self. Then she had set the cup down and gone through the iron door into the tower and climbed. The lamp room in the morning light was different from the afternoon. The sea, visible in every direction from the lantern gallery, closer and more particular in the morning. The waves, not the distant swells she had seen from the cliff path yesterday, but the actual sea, individual and close, the colour of pewter and slate, moving against the cliff base below the headland. The sky above it pale, the kind of pale that preceded a grey November day rather than any improvement in the weather. She looked at the lamp. The reservoir was lower than it had been yesterday. Not dramatically, not the difference of a lamp burned all night, which would have emptied it considerably. The difference of a lamp burned for several hours and then extinguished, the oil consumed by exactly the quantity that an evening's burning would consume, the wick showing the darkened tip of a wick that had been lit and had burned. Someone had lit the lamp last night. Someone had come to the tower after she had gone to bed, had climbed these stairs in the dark, had lit the lamp and set the mechanism turning, and had presumably stayed to maintain it for the required hours and then extinguished it before dawn. Someone who knew this tower sufficiently well to do all of this in the dark, or close to it, without disturbing her and without leaving any evidence of their presence beyond the lower oil level and the burned wick. She stood in the lamp room and thought about this. She was not frightened. She examined the feeling and found that she was not, that what she felt was something closer to the particular alertness of a researcher who has encountered an anomaly she does not yet have the information to explain. The feeling was familiar. She had felt it many times in the course of her work, standing in front of some old building whose history did not quite match what the records said, and knowing that the gap between those two things was where the actual story lived. She looked around the lamp room more carefully than she had the day before. The small shelf beside the lens housing the oil cans still there, one now slightly lighter than it had been. The folded cloth. Nothing else. Nothing that she had not seen yesterday. The person who had been here had not left anything behind except the evidence of what they had done. She looked at the lamp itself one more time. The reservoir lower, the burned wick, the evidence of a light given to this coast that no one had asked for and no navigational chart required. She went back down the stairs. She walked down to the village mid-morning. The coast path in the November light, brighter today than yesterday. The grey giving way not to sun exactly, but to something less committed to greyness. The clouds higher and the visibility better. The sea below her more clearly itself. She could see further out today, could see at the edge of visibility the shape of what might have been a vessel on the horizon, though the distance made certainty impossible. She thought about ships as she walked, about what a lighthouse meant to a ship at night, to a pilot navigating this particular stretch of coast with its combination of granite headlands and unpredictable currents. She had read enough maritime history to know this coast's reputation, not the worst on the Cornish coast, but not forgiving either. The combination of the headlands and the offshore rocks and the way the currents ran in certain weather, making it the kind of coast where light mattered, where knowing exactly where you were in relation to the land was the difference between a quiet night watch and a catastrophe. Her father had understood this, had understood it with the knowledge of someone who had spent 40 years sending light across this particular stretch of water, who had known the coast's risks the way he knew his own hands, through daily familiarity rather than abstract study. She thought about him climbing to the lamp room every evening, not because he was required to, not after 1962, but because the coast was what it was, and the ships were what they were, and light was what light was, the one thing that changed what was possible in the dark. She reached the village. Polreath in the morning, quieter than she had expected, the harbour front largely deserted, the boats at their moorings, but most of the village apparently occupied elsewhere. The inn was open, its sign out, a thin thread of smoke from its chimney. She went in. The inn's interior was exactly as she remembered. This surprised her. She had expected the particular disappointment of revisiting childhood places and finding them diminished, the way the world consistently revealed itself to be smaller than memory had preserved it. But the inn's low-ceilinged front room, with its stone floor and its wooden bar and its smell of cold stone and old wood, was precisely the same room she had come into occasionally as a child with her father, on the rare evenings he had come down from the headland, and the sameness of it was more affecting than any change would have been. The woman behind the bar looked up. She was perhaps 65, grey-haired, with the particular quality of someone who had been doing the same job in the same place for a very long time and had no ambivalence about it. She looked at Maren for a moment and then said, without any particular surprise, "You'll be William's daughter." Maren confirmed it. The woman introduced herself as Ruth Penrose, who had run the inn for 30 years and had known Maren's father for all of them. She said this with the directness of a woman who saw no point in preliminary conversation when the relevant information could be established immediately. Maren asked for tea. She drank it at the bar and told Ruth, carefully, what she had found in the lamp room the previous afternoon and what she had seen from the spare room window the previous night. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Maren finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. "He never stopped," Ruth said it simply, as a statement of fact, the particular flatness of someone describing something they had known for a long time and had stopped finding remarkable. She said that the lighthouse had been lit every evening for as long as she could remember, that she had grown up in this village, and the lighthouse had been lit when she was a child and had gone on being lit, and she had never given it particular thought because the lighthouse light was simply a fact of Polreath, the same way the tide and the harbour and the headland were facts of Polreath. Maren asked who lit it now. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she said she thought Maren should ask old Cadan Trevose about that, who lived at the end of the harbour front and who had been her father's closest friend in the village for the better part of 30 years. She said this carefully, the carefulness of someone choosing to give enough information and not more. Maren thanked her and finished her tea. She did not find Cadan Trevose at home. The cottage at the end of the harbour front low, stone, curtains open, the signs of someone who lived here and would return, simply had no one in it when she knocked. She stood at the door for a moment and then turned and looked back along the harbour front toward the headland, the lighthouse just visible above the village roofline, the tower pale against the grey November sky. She would come back. She walked back through the village slowly, looking at it in the late morning light. A handful of villagers, she did not recognize the population of the village, had turned over considerably in the 40 years since her childhood, some faces entirely new, others carrying the faint familiarity of people she had known as a child and could not now confidently place. One woman stopped her, a woman of perhaps 80, very small, with the sharp, observant look of someone who had been watching this village for a very long time and had noted everything. She said she had known Maren's mother. She said this directly, the particular directness of very old people who had stopped having time for indirectness. Said she remembered Maren as a child, remembered her father bringing her down to the village on Saturdays, remembered the way William Ashby had been with his daughter, careful, attentive, the attentiveness of a quiet man who did not always know how to show what he felt but was trying. She said his name William, the way someone said the name of a person they had known well and was still in the habit of thinking about in the present tense. Maren thanked her and continued up the coast path. She climbed back to the headland with a particular weight of small, accumulated information, Ruth's careful statement, the empty cottage at the harbour end, the old woman's memory of her father's attentiveness. Each piece not explaining anything by itself, but adding to a picture she was only beginning to see the outline of. She went back to his bedroom when she returned to the cottage. The small notebook was where she had left it on the chest of drawers, beside the compass and her mother's stone. She picked it up and took it to the sitting room and sat in his chair the first time she had sat in it. The particular and unexpected intimacy of it the chair shaped entirely to him and receiving her differently, and opened it. It was a ship's log, or something like one, the format of it borrowed from the maritime logs she recognized from her research work, each entry noting the date and the time and the conditions and what had passed or been observed. But not an official log, not the standardized record of a working lighthouse's observations. Something more personal than that, the private record of a man who had kept a lighthouse for 40 years and had not been able to stop keeping the record even after the official requirement for it had ended. She turned to the first entry. The date, nearly 30 years ago, long after the lighthouse had been officially decommissioned, long after there had been any institutional requirement to record anything. The handwriting she recognized immediately, her father's particular script, small and exact, every letter formed with the care of someone who took precision seriously as a matter of character. She read. The entries were brief weather conditions, visibility, the direction and force of the wind. Vessels observed, their type, their approximate heading, the time at which they passed the point of the headland where the lighthouse stood. Occasionally a note beyond the navigational data, a quality of the evening's light, a change in the sea's behavior, something about the state of the horizon. Brief notes, but precise, the observation of someone who had been looking at this same stretch of water for so long that they noticed when anything was different. She read through the first months of entries, the rhythm of them becoming familiar, the date, the time, the conditions, the vessels, the occasional observation, the same format every evening, as regular as the lamp itself, as regular as the turning of the lens. She began to understand the log not simply as a record, but as an act, the act of paying attention, formalized into a daily practice, the discipline of looking carefully at the same thing every evening and noting what you saw, as though the seeing itself were a duty as real as the lighting of the lamp. She read until the light in the sitting room required her to move to the lamp by the window. Then she kept reading. She found the first reference to Cadan Trevose in an entry from perhaps 20 years ago, a brief note at the end of the standard observations. Cadan came up in the evening. We watched the fishing fleet come in from the west window. She read it twice. The simplicity of it, not the beginning of something, but a mention of something already established, a habit already so regular that it required no explanation. Cadan came up, as though Cadan came up regularly, as though this was a known fact that needed only to be recorded rather than explained. She found more references in the following entries. Not every night, perhaps once or twice a week, sometimes more in the winter entries, the long winter evenings on the headland presumably requiring company in a way the summer did not. Each mention brief, matter of fact, the reference to company, folded into the same format as the navigational observations. Cadan brought fish. Cadan stayed until the lamp was set. A squall came in from the southwest. Cadan and I watched it from the lamp room. She thought about her father and Cadan Trevose watching a squall from the lamp room. The image arrived with unexpected clarity. Two men at the lamp room windows, the storm coming across the water, the lamp turning behind them. The comfort of another person beside you when the weather was doing something large and serious. She turned to the most recent entries. The handwriting here slightly less certain than in the earlier pages, the same precision attempted, the same care in the formation of each letter, but the very slight tremor of an older hand evident if you were looking for it. She read the last few weeks of entries before September, the weeks before he died. The entries continued the same format. The weather, the conditions, the vessels observed. Cadan came up. The lamp set at the usual time, nothing that suggested any awareness of an ending approaching. The entries of a man continuing his practice, attending to the things he attended to, fully engaged in the daily discipline of looking and recording. The last entry was 6 weeks ago. The weather that evening clear, she read. The visibility good. A light wind from the northeast. The vessels observed, 2 fishing boats heading east. And at the end, in the same handwriting but the letters slightly more effortful than usual, a single additional line that the earlier entries had not contained. Cadan knows what to do. She read this line and sat very still in his armchair. Cadan knows what to do. Written in the last entry before his death, written apparently with the knowledge or the premonition that it might be the last entry, a note not for any reader, but perhaps for himself, the confirmation of something he had arranged, some continuity he had ensured before he left. She looked at the entry for a long time. Then she looked out the window at the headland, the lighthouse tower visible from the sitting-room's side window, the lamp room dark in the November afternoon. Cadan Trevose had not been home when she knocked this morning, but Cadan Trevose knew what to do, had apparently been doing it for the 6 weeks since her father's death, coming up to the headland each evening, climbing the tower, lighting the lamp, maintaining the mechanism, and going back down to the village before dawn without asking anyone's permission and without explaining himself to anyone. She thought about this, about the weight of that arrangement, the commitment of it, the faithfulness. An old man coming up the coast path in the October dark every evening for 6 weeks, because his friend had told him he would know what to do, and he had understood what was meant and had done it. She tried the harbour cottage again in the late afternoon. This time the door opened. Cadan Trevose was perhaps 75. She could not have said precisely. His age worn in the particular way of men who had spent their whole lives outdoors, the weathering that made exact guessing difficult. Lean, not tall, with the kind of stillness about him that she had seen in her father and associated with people who had spent long periods alone by water. He looked at her in the doorway with an expression that was not quite surprise, more the expression of someone who has been expecting a particular visitor and is noting that they have arrived. He invited her in without ceremony. The cottage small, the sitting room not unlike her father's, the same functional arrangement of things that needed to be there. A fire going, which she had not had at the Lighthouse cottage, the warmth of it immediate and welcome after the November afternoon. He gestured toward a chair, and she sat, and he sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She told him what she had found in the log. The last entry, Cadan knows what to do. She said it quietly, reading it from the notebook which she had brought with her, and Cadan listened without his expression changing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He told her he had been coming up since September, said this with the same matter-of-factness Ruth had used that morning, the tone of someone describing something that had seemed entirely natural and required no particular explanation. He said that William had asked him, some months before he died, to keep the lamp going if anything happened. Had asked him with the same directness he used for everything. Cadan said no elaboration, no sentiment, simply the practical request and the expectation that it would be understood. She asked why. Cadan looked at her. Then he looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said that she should ask him that herself, and that she had more information in the notebook than she might realize, and that he thought she would find the answer before she was finished reading it. He said this with the gentleness of someone who has decided that some things are better arrived at than delivered. She did not push. She had learned, in her research, that the most important information often arrived in its own time and on its own terms, and that the worst thing a researcher could do was to force a conclusion before the evidence was ready to support it. She thanked Cadan and said she would come back. He nodded, said, "It's a good thing you came," said this simply, looking at the fire. She did not ask what he meant by it. She thought she might understand eventually. She walked back up the coast path to the headland, the November evening coming on the light, going from grey to something darker, the sea below the headland beginning to lose its colour, the lighthouse tower ahead of her on the headland, silent and dark in the early evening, the lamp room not yet lit. Not yet. She built a fire in the sitting room fireplace when she got back. The full wood basket her father had left, or that someone had filled, providing everything she needed. She knelt on the hearthstone and built it the way her father had taught her as a child, which was the way she had always built fires since, and lit it, and sat back in his chair with the notebook and the fire and the sound of the November wind outside the cottage walls. She continued reading, working backward through the entries now from the last one, not the sequence in which they had been written, but the sequence in which the information felt most important to approach. She read the entries from the months before his death, then the year before that, then further back, looking for whatever it was Cadan had suggested she would find if she read carefully. The vessels observed continued through every season. She was beginning to know them, the regular fishing boats she had been reading all afternoon, the occasional larger vessels passing further out, the seasonal variation in traffic on this stretch of coast that had been consistent enough across 30 years that her father had noted departures from it, the way he noted changes in the weather. She found an entry from perhaps 15 years ago that was longer than most. The standard observations: first weather clear, visibility excellent, the kind of night the log recorded regularly. Then the vessels, 2 fishing boats heading west, 1 cargo vessel on the southern horizon, and then a third entry that made her stop. The Mary Rose, she read, heading south-southeast, passing the point at approximately 10 o'clock. She has passed here before I am certain of it. The lines of her are too particular to mistake. I do not know if the light helped her tonight, but I lit it as I always do and let her decide for herself. She read this paragraph several times. I do not know if the light helped her tonight, but I lit it as I always do and let her decide for herself. The particular quality of that sentence, the modesty of it, the refusal to claim that the light was necessary or decisive, the simple statement of the practice without requiring the practice to justify itself. I lit it as I always do. She looked up from the notebook and at the fire, then at the window, the darkness outside now, proper darkness, the November evening fully arrived, the sea invisible below the headland. She thought about the Mary Rose, about the vessel her father had recognized passing this coast 15 years ago and had been certain he had seen before, about what it meant to know a ship's silhouette well enough to recognize it at night, at distance, through old glass. The knowledge of someone who had been watching this particular stretch of water for 40 years and had developed the intimate familiarity with its traffic that came from that kind of sustained attention. She turned more pages, found the Mary Rose again 3 years later, and again the following summer, and twice more in years after that, always heading south-southeast, always at approximately the same time of year, always noted with the same precision and the same particular attention that the other regular vessels did not quite receive. She thought, there was something about that ship, she thought, That is not the most important thing in this notebook, but it is something. Outside, the lighthouse came on. She felt it before she saw it, the movement of light through the cottage, the beam from the lamp room reaching the sitting room window and sweeping past, the same 4-second rhythm as the night before. She looked up from the notebook and watched the beam sweep across the sitting room ceiling, once and again and again. She thought about Cadan Trevose, about an old man climbing the coast path in the November dark, as he had climbed it for 6 weeks, because his friend had asked him to, and because it seemed to him she was beginning to understand as natural and as necessary as anything else that was done on this headland. The lamp lit, the mechanism set turning, the light going out across the November sea in the same 4-second rhythm it had maintained for 140 years. She sat with the notebook in her lap and the fire going and the lighthouse beam moving across the ceiling above her. She thought about her father's last entry. Cadan knows what to do. The confirmation of an arrangement made with the quiet confidence of someone who trusted the person he was entrusting. She thought, he knew this would happen. She thought, he knew someone would come and find the notebook and read it, and eventually understand what the light was for. She was not yet certain she understood, but she was closer than she had been that morning, and the fire was warm, and above the headland the November light was going out across the sea in its steady rhythm, 4 seconds between each sweep, as it had always done. She read through most of the night. Not deliberately, she had not sat down with the intention of reading until the fire went low and the lamp needed refilling, and the notebook's entries had carried her across 3 decades of her father's evenings on this headland. She had simply kept reading, the way you kept reading something that was giving you more with each page than you had expected when you began. The fire had burned to embers before she noticed the cold. She set the notebook down on the side table and looked at the hearth, the last of the fire dying, the room considerably darker than it had been, the lamp on the windowsill, the only real light remaining. Outside the cottage, the lighthouse beam continued its steady passage across the ceiling above her. 4 seconds. 4 seconds. She built the fire up again from what remained in the wood basket. The wood her father had stacked, or that someone had stacked, this thought arriving again, as it had the previous evening, the question of who had filled the basket still unanswered, alongside the larger questions the notebook was raising in their careful, systematic way. She sat back in his chair and picked up the notebook again. She had found 11 references to the Mary Rose. She had marked the pages with slips of paper torn from the notebook's back pages, the instinct of a researcher, the habit of making a finding findable again, and now she went back through them in sequence, reading each one not as she had the first time, in the flow of reading, but as evidence, the way she read primary sources in her research work. The first reference, 15 years ago, heading south-southeast, the lines of her too particular to mistake. I lit it, as I always do, and let her decide for herself. The second, 3 years later, a note of relief in this one that the first had not had the Mary Rose again, same heading, same time of year. Her running lights visible clearly tonight, the weather good. I am glad of the clear weather. The third, no emotion in this one, the usual brevity, but the entry slightly longer than the standard ones, 2 additional lines, the description of the vessel's passage more detailed than usual, the time noted to the minute rather than the approximate hour, as though the Mary Rose warranted more precision than other vessels, more care in the observation. She read all 11 in sequence. The pattern of them appearing with the regularity of something seasonal, always south-southeast, always at approximately the same time of year, though not always the same month, as though the vessel's schedule was consistent in its general shape but not in its precise timing, always noted with a slightly different quality of attention than the other vessels, a slightly greater care in the recording. The most recent reference was from 2 years ago. She read it several times. The standard observations first. Then, the Mary Rose again tonight. Later than I expected, nearly midnight, before she passed the point. She is running a different schedule than previous years, or the weather has delayed her. I kept the lamp burning an extra hour to be certain. She read that last sentence carefully. I kept the lamp burning an extra hour to be certain. Not the lamp burning as it always burned, not the standard hours of a lighthouse performing its standard function. An extra hour beyond the usual practice, specifically to ensure that this particular vessel would have the light as it passed. She set the notebook down again. She looked at the fire she had rebuilt, now burning properly, the room warmer than it had been for the past hour. Outside the window, the lighthouse beam continued Cadan's work, the old man somewhere in the tower, above the cottage, maintaining the lamp that her father had asked him to maintain, doing what he had been asked to do, with the same uncomplicated faithfulness that the notebook suggested had characterized 30 years of friendship. She thought about the Mary Rose, about a vessel her father had watched pass this coast 11 times across 15 years, always noted with a particular quality of attention, always mentioned in a way that suggested the observation mattered, in a way that the observation of other vessels did not quite matter. She did not yet know why, but she was beginning to understand that the why was here, in the notebook, if she read carefully enough. She kept reading. She found it in an entry from 18 years ago. Not a reference to the Mary Rose itself. There had been no sighting that autumn, the vessel absent from the log for nearly a year and a half at that point, and the absence itself noted in a line that she had passed over on her first reading without fully attending to it. She read the entry again now. The weather that evening, a November storm, considerable, the kind of night the log noted with technical precision and occasional additional observation. The vessels observed none. The storm precluding traffic on this stretch of coast. And then, below the standard entries, a paragraph longer than almost anything else in the notebook. 18 years since Thomas left on the Mary Rose for the last time. She read this sentence, and the room became very still. Not the cottage becoming quieter, she was aware of the fire, and the wind and the lighthouse beam above her, all of them continuing as before. But something stilled in her, the particular stilling of a researcher who has arrived at the thing they were looking for without having known precisely what shape it would take. She kept reading. 18 years since Thomas left on the Mary Rose for the last time. He was 22 years old. Margaret was already ill, and I should not have let him go, should have asked him to stay, at least until she was better. But I did not ask, and he was 22, and the berth was available, and I thought there would be more time. There is always more time, until there is not. He went, and your mother died that February, and I have lit this light every evening since, in case he is watching from wherever he is and wondering if he is still known here. He has not come back. I do not know if he will, but the light is here. She sat with this for a long time, the fire going, the wind against the cottage walls, the lighthouse beam moving across the ceiling in its steady 4-second rhythm. Thomas. She had not known about Thomas. She turned this fact over carefully, the way she turned new information over in her research, not dismissing the surprise of it, not rushing to integrate it, but simply holding it first and letting it be what it was. A brother, older or younger. The entry did not say 22 years old, 18 years ago, which made him approximately her own age, which meant he was older. She had not known she had a brother, or one had had a brother who had left on a vessel called the Mary Rose and had not come back, and her father had kept the lighthouse burning for the subsequent 18 years in case Thomas was out there somewhere on the water and looking toward this headland and wanting to know if he was still known here. The light is here. 3 words at the end of the longest paragraph in the notebook, after everything else that had been said. Not here for the ships, not here for the coast, not here for any of the practical reasons a lighthouse was supposed to exist. Here for Thomas. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. She was not crying, she was aware of this with a slight surprise, having expected the information to arrive with more immediate emotion. What she felt instead was something quieter than crying, something she associated with encounters with the very old or the very large, the particular feeling of standing before something that was larger than your immediate capacity to respond to it and simply having to stand there and wait for the response to arrive in its own time. She picked up the notebook again. She read every entry for the rest of the night. Not looking for more specific information about Thomas, she found very little more than the one long paragraph, the notebook returning after that to its usual brevity, the fact of Thomas absorbed back into the daily practice of observation and recording as though the practice itself were the appropriate response to the fact. But she read everything now differently, understanding what the notebook was not simply a record of vessels observed and weather conditions, but the record of a man keeping faith with someone he had lost, in the only way available to him, on a headland above the Cornwall coast, every evening for 40 years. The Mary Rose had carried Thomas away, and the Mary Rose had returned to this coast 11 times in the 15 years since her father had first recorded it in the notebook, which meant the sightings began 3 years after Thomas had gone, which meant her father had been watching for 3 years before the vessel came back into sight, and he could note it with a relief that came through even in the spare language of the log, the relief of someone who had been watching for something and finally seen it. She thought about what it meant to see the Mary Rose. Not Thomas himself, the notebook never suggested Thomas was on board, never claimed a sighting of him or a contact with the vessel or any communication. Simply the vessel itself, the ship that had taken him, continuing to travel this coast on its own schedule, passing the lighthouse that her father kept burning and going on south-southeast toward wherever it was going. The sight of it enough, simply the vessel's passage close enough to be visible from the lamp room window, proof that the ship that had carried his son still existed and still travelled and still found its way past this light without difficulty. She thought. He was keeping the light for Thomas, she thought, and for the Mary Rose, and for whatever the Mary Rose represented, the possibility, never confirmed and never abandoned, that Thomas was somewhere out there and the light on this headland might mean something to him, might say what her father apparently could not say in any other way, that he was still here, that the light was still here, that whatever had passed between them when Thomas left could not extinguish the fact of the light. The fire went low again before she noticed. She looked up from the notebook and found that the room had grown cold and the wood basket was empty, and the first suggestion of dawn was visible at the window to the east, the sky, not yet light, but committed now to becoming light. the darkness losing its absoluteness in the way it did in the hour before sunrise. Outside, the lighthouse was still burning, still sweeping its beam across the November sea, 4 seconds between each sweep, the light doing what it had been doing all night and every night for weeks and years and decades. She watched the beam sweep past the window, past again, past again. Then, in the growing dawn light, it went out, the lighthouse dark. Caden going home, she thought, going back down the coast path in the early morning the way he had been going for 6 weeks, the night's work done. She thought about going to the window to watch him on the path, and then did not some instinct telling her that some things were better, not observed too directly, that Cadan's faithfulness to her father's request was the kind of thing that deserved to continue in its own privacy. She sat in her father's chair as the room grew gradually lighter, the notebook on her knee, the cold hearth, the lighthouse dark outside. She thought about Thomas, about a brother she had not known she had, who was approximately her own age, and who had left on a merchant vessel when she was still a small child, and who had apparently, and she was reading this now, only in the silence between the notebook's lines, in what the notebook chose not to say as much as what it said not come back, not been in contact, not written or returned or made any communication that the notebook recorded, and she did not believe her father would have failed to record such a thing if it had happened. She thought about her father keeping this from her, trying to understand his reasons, the particular reasons of a quiet man who did not discuss difficult things, who had found a way to carry grief that was entirely his own and apparently felt no compulsion to share it. She thought about all the times she had visited this cottage as a child, had climbed to the lamp room with him, had watched him light the lamp without knowing what the light was for. She had thought the light was for the ships. She had thought it was simply what her father did. The discipline of his work continued past the point where it was officially required. It was for Thomas. It had always been for Thomas. She slept for a few hours in the morning. Not in the armchair, she went to the spare room bed and lay down fully dressed and slept the flat, deep sleep of someone who has not slept and whose body has decided to address this without consulting the mind. She woke at mid-morning with the particular clarity of someone who has slept briefly and well, the information she had gathered overnight still fully present, settled now rather than raw. She went to find Cadan, the harbour cottage this time with the door open before she reached it, as though he had seen her coming down the coast path from his window. She went in without knocking and sat in the chair she had sat in the previous evening and looked at him across the fire he had built in the interval since coming down from the headland. She said Thomas's name, just that, simply the name, offered without context, watching Cadan's face. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You found it." Not a question. The particular tone of someone who had expected this to happen and was simply confirming that it had. She asked him what he knew. He told her, slowly, with the carefulness of someone who had been holding a story for a long time and was choosing how to tell it, not what to leave out, she sensed, but how to say what was true without making it more or less than what it was. Thomas Ashby had been 5 years older than Maren. He had grown up on the headland the same way Maren had, the same coast path, the same lighthouse, the same view. But Thomas had never shared their father's relationship with the place, had found the headland isolating rather than sufficient, had been restless in the way some people were restless, the particular restlessness of someone who felt the horizon as a calling rather than a boundary. Their mother had died when Maren was 11, and Thomas was 16. And Thomas, in the 2 years that followed, had become someone their father had struggled to reach, not hostile, Cadan was careful to say, not unkind, but gone somehow, before he had physically left. The particular absence of a young person who has already decided that their life will happen somewhere else and is simply waiting for the practical means to enact that decision. He had left at 22, a berth on the Mary Rose, a merchant vessel running between the south coast and various European ports. Their father had not asked him to stay this much, Cadan confirmed. The notebook's own account corroborated. He had not asked, and Thomas had gone, and the last conversation they had had before Thomas walked down the coast path for the last time was whatever it had been, whatever insufficient thing two people said to each other when they did not know it was the last time. Thomas had written once, a letter from Lisbon, 6 months after he left. A brief letter. Cadan said he had not read it, but William had shown it to him, had read aloud from it once in the lamp room on a winter evening years later, had read it with the tone of someone who had read it many times and knew it entirely but still needed occasionally to hear it aloud. The letter had said Thomas was well, had said he was seeing things he had never expected to see, had said nothing about coming back and nothing about not coming back. No letter after that. Cadan said this with the particular flatness of someone delivering a fact they had been delivering for years, the flatness of something said so many times it had worn smooth. No word, no contact, no way of knowing whether Thomas was alive and simply silent, or whether something else had happened in the years since. The Mary Rose, continuing to sail, Cadan had confirmed that much, had made inquiries himself some years ago, the vessel registered and active and sailing its routes. But whether Thomas was still on her or had long since moved on to some other ship or life, he could not say. She asked why her father had never told her. Cadan looked at the fire. Then he said that William had not been a man who could talk about things that had broken something in him, that he could attend to them, could light the lamp every evening and keep the log and watch for the Mary Rose and write. Cadan knows what to do as a final instruction, but that talking about them was a different kind of thing, entirely, a kind he had not been given the equipment for. He said. He lit the light for Thomas. And then, after a pause, he lit the light for your mother too, and for the ships that needed it. And because it was what he did, in the end, what he was, on that headland, it was not possible to say it was for only one thing. Maren sat with this, the fire between them, the November morning outside the harbour cottage window, the sea visible at the end of the harbour, grey and cold and entirely present. She thought about her father lighting the lamp every evening for 40 years. For her mother, who had loved this headland and died too early. For Thomas, who had left and not come back and might or might not know there was still a light on the headland that was lit for him. For the vessels that passed in the dark and needed the bearing. For the practice itself, the daily discipline of climbing the stairs and trimming the wick and setting the mechanism turning. The act of attending to something faithfully, because faithfulness was what you had when everything else had become uncertain. She thought, I did not know any of this. She thought, he was on that headland for 40 years, and I did not know the most important thing about why. She went back to the lighthouse in the early afternoon. Not to look at the lamp room again. She had seen everything in the lamp room that there was to see, and the lamp room had told her what it could. She went back to the cottage and to the sitting room and to his books, which she had looked at on the first day and not properly examined. She went through them slowly, taking each one from the shelf and holding it and opening it, looking for whatever he might have left inside the things he kept. She had learned from her research that people left things in books, that books were frequently the repositories of the small private records that did not have a proper place elsewhere. Notes, letters, pressed flowers, photographs, the accumulated small evidences of a reading life. She found photographs in 2 of the books. The first, a small photograph of her mother, younger than in any photograph Maren had seen before, perhaps 20 years old, standing on the headland with the sea behind her, laughing at something outside the frame. She had not seen this photograph. She sat on the floor with her back against the bookshelf and looked at it for a long time, her mother at 20, laughing, the lighthouse visible over her shoulder in the summer light. The second photograph was of a young man, taken on the harbour front. She thought the harbour wall visible behind him, a boat at the edge of the frame. Perhaps 20 years old, dark-haired, with a quality about the way he stood that she recognized without being able to immediately explain the recognition, the particular way of inhabiting a space that was familiar to her from somewhere. She looked at the photograph for a long time and then understood she recognized it because it was her own quality, the same way she stood, the same angle of the head. Thomas. She had no confirmation of this. There was nothing written on the back of the photograph, no name, no date. But she knew, with the certainty that came sometimes from looking at the evidence of a thing for long enough, that she was looking at her brother, at the young man who had walked down the coast path with a berth on the Mary Rose and had written 1 letter from Lisbon and had not been in contact since. She set both photographs carefully on the side table. She finished going through the books, found 2 more small things, a folded paper that turned out to be a tide chart from many years ago, annotated in her father's handwriting, and a single pressed flower between the pages of a maritime history volume, so old and dry that it crumbled slightly at her touch, unidentifiable. She went to the window. The afternoon sea in November, lower cloud today than yesterday, the light coming off the water flat and without warmth. No vessels visible from the cottage window, the sea empty in the visible portion. She thought about the Mary Rose out there somewhere on its route, whatever its route was, wherever it was between sightings. She thought about Thomas, if Thomas was still on her, looking out from the vessel's rail at the approaching coastlines of the ports he visited and seeing nothing she could imagine. She thought about what she wanted to do. Not the practical questions, those were still unresolved, the cottage and the lighthouse, and the whole question of what happened to this headland after she returned to London still waiting to be answered. Something more immediate than that. Something about tonight. She went to the tower in the early evening. Before Cadan, she went while the lamp room was still dark, while there was still enough of the day's light remaining to see clearly, and she climbed the stairs and came out into the lamp room and stood before the lens in the fading November light and looked at the oil lamp at its center. The reservoir full? She had not refilled it, Cadan, presumably refilling it each evening as part of his maintenance of the lamp, the same way her father had refilled it every evening of his working life. The wick freshly trimmed, the rotation mechanism set and ready, everything prepared. She stood in the lamp room for a long time without doing anything. The November sea visible below in every direction, the coast extending east and west in both directions, the headland below her and the village below that, the lights of the cottages beginning to show as the evening deepened. Somewhere on the harbour front, Cadan's cottage, where a man in his 70s was presumably resting before the evening's work. She thought about her father doing this, standing here in the lamp room in the early evening, the light going outside, the sea becoming the night sea below him, the lamp at the center of the lens waiting to be lit. 40 years of this particular moment, the moment before the light, when the decision to light it was made and enacted, the day's ending and the night's beginning marked by the small specific act of a match to a wick. She thought about Thomas, about what it meant to light a lamp for someone who might never see it, who might be anywhere in the world and entirely unaware that a light on a Cornish headland was burning for him. The faith of that, not the religious faith, though she could see the connection, but the simpler and perhaps more radical faith of continuing to do something without any confirmation that it served its purpose, simply because the doing of it was the only thing available and therefore the thing that was done. I lit it as I always do and let her decide for herself. Her father's words in the notebook. Let her decide, the ship deciding, the sea deciding, whatever force governed the movement of vessels past this headland deciding whether the light mattered on any given night. Her father's job was only to light it. The rest was not his to control. She reached for the matches on the shelf beside the oil cans, her hand on the box. She stood still for a moment, the matchbox in her hand, and thought about what she was doing. Then she lit the lamp. The flame took immediately, the wick well trimmed, the oil fresh, the lamp designed for exactly this and ready to perform it. The flame, small at first, contained within the lamp housing, then building to its proper brightness as the lamp established its equilibrium. She set the rotation mechanism, turning the switch she had identified on her first visit to the lamp room, the mechanism that engaged the turning of the lens, and stepped back. The lamp room filled with light. The Fresnel lens doing what it was made to do, taking the lamp's single source and amplifying and directing it outward through the prisms, the beam emerging from the lens and sweeping out across the November sea in its steady 4-second rhythm. The same beam her father had produced from this lamp room every evening for 40 years, the same light that had gone out across this coast for 140 years before that. She stood in the turning light and looked out at the sea, the beam sweeping east and then south and then west, covering the full arc of the visible water, illuminating and releasing and illuminating again, the light going out across the darkness without knowing or caring where it arrived, simply going present and consistent and entirely itself. She heard Cadan on the stairs, his step recognizable now. The second time she had heard it, the particular careful step of an older man on spiral iron stairs in the dark. He came up through the hatch and stopped when he saw her, and for a moment they looked at each other in the light of the turning lens. Then he came fully into the lamp room and stood beside her and looked out at the sea. Neither of them spoke for a while. The lamp turning, the beam going out, the November sea receiving it as it received everything with the vast, uncurated acceptance of something that simply was. He said, after a while, he would be glad you lit it. She did not answer immediately. She was looking at the sea, at the particular way the beam caught the surface of each wave as it swept past, the wave illuminated for a fraction of a second and then dark again. The whole sea in this constant flicker of light and dark that was not quite either. She thought about her father, about the 40 years of evenings in this room, the 40 years of this view, the 40 years of the beam going out and the sea receiving it and the light going on and on, regardless of whether anyone out there was watching or needing it. She thought about Thomas somewhere on the water or somewhere off it, somewhere in a life she could not imagine from here, and the letter from Lisbon that had said nothing about coming back. She thought about what she was going to do. Not tomorrow, not the practical decisions about the cottage and the lighthouse, Those could wait. Tonight, she was going to stand in this lamp room with Cadan Trevose and watch the light go out across the November sea the way her father had watched it. And she was going to stay until the lamp needed to be extinguished. And then she was going to go back down the stairs and into the cottage and sleep. Tomorrow she would begin to understand what came next. Tonight, the light. She stood in the turning beam and looked out at the dark sea and let the lamp room fill with the steady rhythm of the light going out and coming back and going out again. 4 seconds between each sweep. The same 4 seconds her father had counted for 40 years. The same interval the lighthouse had maintained for 140 years before that. The light is here. 3 words in a notebook entry from 18 years ago. She understood them now, understood not just what they meant, but what they cost, the particular cost of saying something that simply and continuing to enact it, evening after evening, without requiring it to be acknowledged or received, or to do anything other than go out across the water and be present in the dark. The beam swept past. 4 seconds. Passed again. She stayed in the lamp room until midnight. Cadan had left before her, had said good night at some point around 10 o'clock, had descended the stairs with the same careful step she had heard on his way up, had presumably gone back down the coast path to the harbour cottage and his own bed. She had not followed immediately. She had stayed in the lamp room with the turning lens and the November sea and the particular quality of a place where the same thing had been done every evening for a very long time, the atmosphere of accumulated practice that was not quite silence and not quite sound. She extinguished the lamp at midnight. The way Cadan had shown her the particular order of steps, the mechanism disengaged first, and then the lamp reduced, and then out, the sequence that prevented the lens from continuing to turn without a lamp at its center. She did this carefully, following the sequence, and the lamp room went dark, and the darkness, after the brightness of the turning beam, was very complete for the first few seconds until her eyes adjusted. She stood in the dark lamp room, the November sea below in every direction, no longer lit by the beam, simply itself the sound of it coming up the cliff face, the particular sound of the sea at midnight in November, unhurried and enormous, and entirely indifferent to whether there was a light above it or not. She put her hand on the cool glass of the lantern and looked out at the darkness for a while. Then she went down the stairs and to bed. She slept well for the first time since arriving. Not the flat, exhausted sleep of the previous morning, but something fuller, a sleep that felt chosen rather than surrendered to, the sleep of someone who had worked hard at something and found, at the end of the working, that the body was ready. She woke to the particular grey light of a November morning on the Cornwall coast and lay still for a moment, aware of the headland and the cottage and the lighthouse around her, in a way she had not been on the first morning, not as things she was visiting, but as things she was waking up inside. She thought about Thomas before she got up, had been thinking about him in the night. She was aware, not dreaming of him exactly, but carrying him through her sleep, the way new information sometimes worked its way through sleep before it fully arrived in waking. Thomas at 22 on the harbour front, the photograph from the book, the particular way of standing she had recognised. Thomas on the Mary Rose, heading south toward Lisbon and writing one letter and then what? She did not know what. That was the fact she had to hold, the simple central fact that the notebook and Cadan between them had not been able to resolve, and that she understood now she would not be able to resolve from this cottage on this headland, without more information than she currently had. Thomas had left. He had written once. He had not written again. He was 45 years old now, or 45 years old and she held this possibility plainly rather than flinching from it if he was still alive. She got up and went to make tea. The kitchen in the morning, the familiar small routine of it already establishing itself after only 2 full days, the tin in the same place, the pan on the range, the sound of the kettle. She stood at the kitchen window while the water heated and looked at the inland moorland and thought that she was going to have to try to find Thomas. Not today. She did not have the means to begin that search from here, did not have access to the records and registers and shipping company archives that the task would require. But she was going to do it. Had decided this somewhere in the night, some time between the lamp going out and sleep arriving. She was going to use the skills her research had given her, the patience and the methodology and the knowledge of where records lived and how to read them, and she was going to try to find what had happened to Thomas Ashby. After the letter from Lisbon, she made her tea and drank it and thought about how to begin. She went to Cadan's cottage in the morning, the day clear and cold, the coastal path fully exposed to a northeasterly wind that had no equivocation about its direction or its purpose. She came down the path quickly, the cold making dawdling impractical, and found Cadan in his front room with a fire built against the morning chill, apparently expecting her, or simply prepared for the possibility she had not been able to fully distinguish these two things in her brief acquaintance with him. She asked him whether he knew anything about the Mary Rose. About the vessel itself, not the sightings in the log, which she understood now, but the practical particulars of the ship. What company operated it, what its regular routes were, whether there was any way of tracing a crew member from 23 years ago. Cadan was quiet for a moment. Then he went to a drawer in the dresser beside the fire and came back with an envelope. He held it for a moment without offering it to her, the particular hesitation of someone deciding whether the time for a thing has arrived. He said, "Your father gave me this," said it had been given to him perhaps 5 years ago, with instructions to give it to whoever came when he was gone. He had assumed, he said, that whoever came would be Maren, had assumed this without any specific instruction to that effect, simply knowing that she was who was left. He had been waiting to give it to her. He had thought she needed to find the notebook first. He held out the envelope. She took it. Her name was on the front in her father's handwriting, the same handwriting as the notebook, the same small, precise script, the same care in the formation of each letter. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened it. The letter was 2 pages. The longest thing she had ever seen him write her father, who wrote in the brief, precise style of the ship's log in everything he put on paper, who had sent her short letters throughout her childhood and adult life that communicated exactly what needed to be communicated and nothing beyond it. 2 pages, in the same small handwriting, the lines close together, the pages full. She read it in Cadan's front room with the fire going, and Cadan sitting across from her, giving her the space of his own quiet. "Dear Maren," the letter began, "I have never been good at saying things directly. You know this, you grew up with it, and I am sorry for the difficulties it has caused, which I am aware are considerable. I am writing this because I am becoming aware that there are things you will need to know after I am gone, and that I am not likely to tell you while I am here, which is a failure I have no good excuse for, and which I am attempting to address in the only way I seem to be capable of." She read slowly. Her father describing Thomas, describing him in a way the notebook had not, with the directness that writing apparently allowed him more than speech. Thomas as a child, stubborn, funny, afraid of the dark in a way he had been ashamed of and tried to hide, a boy who had made their mother laugh more than anyone else could. Thomas at 16 after their mother died, becoming a different kind of quiet than their father's quiet, not the quiet of a man who had found a way to live with his inner life, but the quiet of someone who had not yet found any way at all. She read the section about Thomas leaving. Her father's account of it different from Cadan's, more particular, the account of someone who had been in the room rather than someone who had been told about it afterward. The last morning, Thomas with his bag at the cottage door, the walk down the coast path together, father and son, the harbour front, the Mary Rose, at the dock. What had been said, very little, her father admitted, far less than should have been said, the particular paralysis of a man who could feel everything and say almost nothing coming down on him exactly when it was least useful. He wrote, "I watched the Mary Rose leave the harbour, and I did not shout. I have thought about that for 23 years. I did not shout his name. I did not run back up the path to the lighthouse and light the lamp so he could see it from the harbour mouth. I simply watched and then walked back up to the headland and started the lamp at the usual time that evening, as I always had, and I have started it at the usual time every evening since. I cannot tell you why, except that it seemed to me, and has seemed to me every evening since, that this was the only thing I had that might still be visible to him wherever he went." She turned to the second page. Her father's handwriting slightly less certain here, as though the first page had taken what steadiness he had, and the second page was being written on what remained. He wrote about the letter from Lisbon. Read it to her, essentially quoted from it at length, the words of a 22-year-old man that she recognized in their phrasing as Thomas's, even without having known Thomas. The same stubborn economy, the same reluctance to admit feeling, while the feeling was clearly there in every line. Thomas writing about the sea, about the work of the vessel, about Lisbon in autumn, which he described in one sentence as finer than anything he had expected. Not writing about coming back, not writing about staying away, writing as someone does who is mid-journey and cannot yet see the shape of it from inside. He wrote, "I do not know if he has been happy. I do not know if the life he found when he left the headland is the life he wanted, or something else he settled for, or something he is still looking for. I know the Mary Rose has come past this light 11 times since I first saw her in the log, which tells me the vessel is active, and has run this route for many years, which tells me nothing about Thomas. It is possible he left the Mary Rose long ago. It is possible he has a life I know nothing about in some port city I have never visited. It is possible he has not been well, or has not been at all, and I try not to think about this for long, but sometimes I think about it. I am lighting the lamp regardless. I am lighting it because it is what I do, and because the coast needs it even if he does not, and because if he is out there somewhere and he passes this headland in the dark, I want there to be a light. I want him to be able to look toward the shore and see something that says, 'You are still known here.'" She read this paragraph twice. "You are still known here." Her father's version of everything he had not said on the harbour front 23 years ago, transmitted every evening in the only language he could manage with any consistency. The letter ended, "I am sorry I did not tell you about Thomas while I could. I am sorry for the distance between us, which I made and you suffered, and which I regret more than I know how to say, which is perhaps why I am saying it in a letter rather than to your face. You are a careful, patient person who looks at things properly before she decides what they mean, and I am glad of that. I hope you will look at what you find here carefully before you decide what to do with it. I do not have a preference for what you decide. The lighthouse is yours. The choice is yours. I only ask that you light it once before you go. I think you will understand why when you do. With all my love, your father, William. She sat in Caden's front room with the letter in her hands for a long time. The fire between them, Caden entirely still across from her, giving her the patience of someone who had known her father for 30 years and had learned patience from the acquaintance. She thought about her father writing those 2 pages, about the effort of it, the man she knew in the notebook, the man of brief, precise sentences, writing 2 full pages of something that cost him considerably more than sentences. She thought about him giving the envelope to Cadan 5 years ago, making the arrangement, ensuring that it would reach her even if he was not there to give it himself. The preparation of a man who was beginning to understand that time had a shape. She thought, I only ask that you light it once before you go. She had already done it. Had done it last night without yet having read the letter. Had done it because standing in the lamp room with the matches in her hand had seemed like the only possible thing to do in that moment. She thought about that, about having fulfilled her father's request before she knew it was a request, about whatever it was that had made the action feel necessary before she understood its necessity. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She looked at Cadan. He looked back at her. She said, I'm going to find him. Cadan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, simply, good. She spent the rest of the day making notes. She had her research notebooks with her, had brought them instinctively, the way she always brought them when she went anywhere, the habit of a person whose work and whose way of thinking were not easily separated from each other. She sat in her father's armchair in the afternoon light and wrote down everything she knew about Thomas Ashby and the Mary Rose, organizing it the way she organized the sources for any research project, by date, by reliability, by what it confirmed and what it left open. What she knew. Thomas Ashby, born approximately 45 years ago on this headland, left at 22 on a merchant vessel called the Mary Rose, route including the South English coast and various European ports. Wrote 1 letter from Lisbon. No further contact with his father for 23 years. The Mary Rose documented as an active vessel in regular service, sighted from this lighthouse 11 times over 15 years, last sighted 2 years ago, heading south-southeast. What she did not know, whether Thomas had remained on the Mary Rose or moved to other vessels, whether he was in contact with anyone she could reach, whether he was alive, whether he knew about their father's death, whether he had any interest in being found. She wrote this last question down and looked at it. It was the question her father had not asked, had not attempted to answer, had simply sent the light out every evening and let Thomas decide for himself, as he had put it in the notebook, what the light meant and what he wanted to do about it. She was not her father. She was going to ask the question directly, using every methodological tool available to her, and see what the evidence said. But that was for London, for the archives and the shipping records and the registration databases and all the other repositories of information her research life had taught her to navigate. That work could not be done from here. What could be done from here was something different. She walked the headland in the late afternoon, not the coast path down to the village, the headland itself, the open ground above the cliff, the path that ran along the edge toward the eastern promontory, and the view it gave of the full sweep of the coast in both directions. She had walked this path as a child, had walked it with her father on the Sunday mornings when he came away from the lighthouse long enough for a proper walk, the two of them in the sea wind with the world very large around them and very few words necessary. The late afternoon light on the coast, better today than the previous days, the cloud higher, the light reaching down to the water at a more useful angle, the sea showing its colours properly for the first time since she had arrived. Not blue, not in November, but not the flat pewter of the first 2 days, a deeper colour, the colour of something that existed in its own terms and was not merely the reflection of the sky above it. She walked to the eastern promontory and stood at the edge, the lighthouse behind her to the west, visible from here over her shoulder, the white tower and the lamp room and the cottage attached to its base, the whole structure small against the scale of the headland and the sea beyond. She turned and looked at it. She thought about the decision she needed to make. The practical decision, the one she had come here to make and had not yet made because she had been occupied with everything else the lighthouse and the cottage and the notebook had turned out to contain. The decision about what to do with this place, whether to sell it, which was the practical and uncomplicated answer, or whether some other answer was possible that she had not yet fully formulated. She thought about her flat in London, her work, her routines, the life that had its own shape and momentum. She had been away from it for 3 days, and it felt, from here, like something that existed in a different register than this headland, not less real, but differently real, the way things felt when you had put sufficient physical distance between yourself and them. She thought about her father staying, not the specific reasons which she now understood, but the bare fact of it, the 40 years, the daily practice, the discipline of attending to this one place and this one task, and not being moved from either by anything the world offered as an alternative. She had not inherited that quality, had been moved from this headland at 11 and had not properly come back, had built a life in London that suited her in most of the ways lives needed to suit the people who lived them. But she thought about the lamp room, about standing at the lens housing last night with the matchbox in her hand and feeling the action that was required of her as clearly as she had ever felt anything required of her, not a decision, not a weighing of options, but a simple recognition of what was the right thing and what was not. She thought about the beam going out across the November sea and the particular quality of the night's watch, standing with Cadan in the turning light and looking at the water and understanding, without fully articulating it, what the light was for. She stood at the promontory for a long time, the wind pressing steadily from the northeast, the lighthouse behind her, the sea below. Then she walked back. She found Cadan on the coast path, coming up. His usual time, the early evening, the lamp to be lit before full dark. She fell into step beside him on the path, the two of them walking up together in the wind without speaking, which was comfortable in the way that silence was comfortable with some people and not others. At the top of the path she said, "I want to keep lighting it." He did not answer immediately. They had reached the headland, and the lighthouse was ahead of them, the lamp room dark in the last of the afternoon. Caden looked at the lighthouse and then at her. He said, "For how long?" She said she did not know yet, said she had to go back to London, that she had work and a life there, that she could not simply leave without resolution, but that she was going to come back, that she was not ready to sell the cottage or close the lighthouse or let the headland become someone else's question to answer. She said, I'm going to find Thomas first. And then she said, and until I know what I've found, I want the light to be here. In case he passes and looks toward the shore. Cadan looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I'll keep coming up until you come back. Said it matter-of-factly, the way he said everything, not like a promise being made, but like a practical fact being established, the same tone he used for the weather and the lamp oil and everything else that was simply what it was. She thanked him. He went toward the tower door. She went to the cottage. She made her supper in the small kitchen and ate it at the kitchen table. Outside the cottage, the beam was going. She could see the reflection of it in the kitchen window glass when it passed, the light sweeping through its rotation and briefly illuminating the glass from the direction of the tower. 4 seconds between each sweep. The same rhythm her father had set every evening of his life here, the same rhythm Cadan had maintained for 6 weeks, the same rhythm she had set last night with her own hand. She sat at the table after she had eaten and looked at the letter. She had taken it from her coat pocket and set it on the kitchen table, the 2 pages she had read in Cadan's cottage, folded and refolded and now lying flat. She read it again slowly, the second time different from the first the way. The second reading of something important was always different. The surprise gone, the comprehension deeper, the specific words more fully received now that she had had the afternoon to begin absorbing what they contained. I only ask that you light it once before you go. I think you will understand why when you do. She understood, had understood last night, standing in the turning beam with the matchbox still in her hand and the November sea below in every direction, the understanding arriving not as a thought, but as a physical thing, the particular quality of the lamp room, the particular feeling of the light going out, the particular sense of something enacted rather than simply done. She put the letter back in her coat pocket and went to the sitting room. She sat in his chair, not with the notebook this time, simply in the chair, in the room, with the lighthouse beam moving across the ceiling above her and the fire she had built going quietly in the grate. She thought about her father in this chair. The 40 years of evenings after the lamp was lit and the log was written and the day's watching was done, the 40 years of this particular chair, in this particular room with this particular fire, the accumulated weight of evenings that had been, in their own way, the substance of a life. She had thought of his life here as diminished by the things it lacked, the family that had dispersed, the son who had not come back, the daughter who had visited too rarely. She was beginning to understand that she had been measuring it against the wrong scale. A man who had lit a lamp every evening for 40 years was not diminished. A man who had kept faith with the same practice for 4 decades, who had maintained a piece of this coast's safety and a piece of his own integrity simultaneously, who had found a way to carry grief that did not require putting it down but simply carrying it, evening after evening, up the spiral stairs and into the lamp room where it could be acknowledged and attended to in the only language available, that man had not lived a diminished life. She had simply not been looking at it properly. She was a researcher. She knew how to look at things properly. She had simply not applied that discipline to the question of her father, which was perhaps the most common failure, the failure to look carefully at the things that were closest, to examine the evidence of the most familiar lives with the same attention you brought to the distant and the historical. She looked at the room around her, the books on the shelf, the armchair she was sitting in, the fire, the small lamp on the windowsill, the lighthouse beam moving across the ceiling every 4 seconds, the photograph in the bedroom herself at 8 or 9, her father's hand on her shoulder, the notebook on the side table beside her, the compass and the stone and the empty space on the chest of drawers where Thomas's photograph now sat, having been brought from the sitting room and placed there by her this afternoon in the arrangement where it seemed to belong. She thought about what she was going to do. The practical shape of it was beginning to emerge, the research into Thomas, which would take months and might not yield what she hoped, and the parallel question of this place and what it needed from her. She was not going to sell it immediately. She was not going to make any permanent decision until she had done what she had told Cadan she was going to do. And in the meantime, Cadan would come up and light the lamp, and the light would go out across the November sea and the December sea after it, and whatever the light was for would continue to be what it was for until she understood better what came next. She was comfortable with this. She was comfortable with the not knowing of it, which surprised her. She was a person who liked resolution, who had built a career on the satisfactions of archival research, precisely because archives gave you eventual answers if you were patient and methodical enough. But the not knowing here felt different from the not knowing she ordinarily found difficult. It felt like the not knowing her father had lived with for 23 years, carrying it up the spiral stairs every evening, neither resolved nor abandoned, simply held and attended to and lit. She went up the tower one more time before sleep. Not to do anything, Caden had lit the lamp and set the mechanism, and the lighthouse was doing what it was doing without requiring anything from her. She went up simply to be in the lamp room once more before her last night on the headland, the night before she took the carrier's cart back to Truro and then the train to London, and the resumption of her ordinary life with this new information inside it. The lamp room in the night, the beam turning. She stood at the lantern glass and looked out at the November sea, the sea she had been looking at for 3 days now, the sea that had been her father's constant view for 40 years, the sea that was simply itself regardless of what anyone thought about it or what lights were lit above it. The beam swept past, out across the water to the south-southeast, toward the shipping lanes her father had watched for decades, toward the routes the Mary Rose travelled, toward whatever was out there on the water tonight that might or might not be able to see a light on this particular headland. She thought about Thomas, about a 45-year-old man somewhere in the world, in whatever life, 23 years, had built for him a life she could not imagine from here because she had no information to imagine it from, and which she was going to spend the coming months trying to find evidence of, using every tool her training had given her. She thought about what she would say if she found him, could not fully formulate it yet, could not know what to say until she knew what she had found and what he knew and what the distance of 23 years had made of the person who had left a one letter from Lisbon and gone silent. She thought, he might not want to be found. She held this thought plainly, without the flinching that would have come 2 days ago. It was possible. People left and did not come back, sometimes because they had arrived somewhere better, and sometimes because the leaving itself was the point, and being found would undo what the leaving had made. She would look for him, and she would find out what there was to find out, and then she would know something she did not know now, and then she would decide what to do with the knowing. Her father had done it differently, had not searched, had not used the tools available to find a son who had been silent for 23 years, had simply kept the light and let Thomas decide for himself whether to come toward it. She understood why, had understood it in the lamp room last night, had understood it more deeply reading the letter this afternoon. Her father had known Thomas well enough to understand that Thomas leaving had been Thomas's decision, and that the response to a decision freely made was not pursuit but presence, the presence of the light on the headland, saying what it said every evening in the only language a lighthouse knew. She was different from her father. She was going to search. She was going to use the records and the databases and the patient, methodical work of a researcher who knew how to find things that had gone quiet. And the lighthouse was going to keep burning while she did it, saying what it had always said, for Thomas and for the ships and for whatever else it was for, which she understood now was not one thing but many things, held together in the single act of keeping a lamp lit on a headland in the dark. The beam swept past. 4 seconds. Passed again. She pressed her hand against the glass and felt the cold of the November night. On the other side of it, the sea cold, the air cold, the darkness cold in the way. November darkness on the Cornwall coast was cold, entirely without apology. And through the glass, the beam going out, warm and specific, doing what it had been built to do. She stayed until the cold drove her down. Then she descended the spiral stairs in the dark, her hand on the iron rail, the beam sweeping above and around her as she went, the lighthouse continuing its work as she left it to continue. She slept in the spare room for the last time, the beam from the lamp room moving across the ceiling above her in its steady rhythm, as it had moved across the ceiling every night she had been here, the same rhythm she had grown up with on this headland and had forgotten and was now remembering in the particular way. You remembered things that had been part of you before you knew how to name them. She thought about the morning. The carrier's cart at 9:30. She had arranged this with the village before coming up the path for the last time. Her bag to pack, the cottage to leave in the order her father's cottage deserved to be left in, Cadan to say goodbye to, the coast path one more time in the morning light. She thought about Thomas, about the shipping company records she would look for in London, the crew registers, the Port Authority logs, the 100 places a careful researcher learned to look when looking for someone who had gone quiet. She was good at this. She had spent her career being good at finding things that had gone quiet. She thought about the letter. In her coat pocket, folded, her father's handwriting on 2 pages. The longest thing he had ever written her. The most direct thing he had ever said. You are still known here. She closed her eyes. Outside the cottage, the beam continued sweeping the November sea in its 4-second rhythm out toward the shipping lanes and the horizon and whatever was there in the dark. The lamp Cadan had lit, which she would light the next time she came, which someone would light every evening in the interval between now and then. The lighthouse doing what lighthouses did, not asking whether anyone was watching, not requiring confirmation that the light was received, simply sending it out and letting the darkness decide what to do with it. The beam swept past, the ceiling of the spare room briefly bright, then dark, then bright again. 4 seconds. She thought of her father climbing those stairs for 40 years, of Thomas somewhere on a dark sea, looking toward a familiar coast, of Cadan in the lamp room above her, keeping the promise no one had asked him to make. The light will be here in the morning. It will be here when you come back. Sleep well.